As you can see quite clearly, the russets moving up into the southeast corner. So it looks as though it's not going to be quite as extreme as the week we're having at the moment. Less hot. There will be some rain at times into the northwest. Not exclusively dry in the southeast, but the best of the drier and warmer weather is likely here. Take care.
Wherever you are, follow the story. Get the news that matters to you by personalising your app. And if you're on the go, you can watch the BBC News channel live. Follow the story wherever you are.
There'll be a new Prime Minister tomorrow in the building behind me as Boris Johnson is elected leader of the Conservative Party. Conservative Party members gave him nearly twice as many votes as Jeremy Hunt. So what's his plan?
Deliver Brexit, unite the country and defeat Jeremy Corbyn. And that is what we're going to do.
Will the real Boris Johnson please stand up? What kind of Prime Minister will he be?
I think it's great. I hope he does good things. I think he will.
No, it's just a clown. Yeah, he's not clever. He's a buffoon.
We'll bring you all the latest as 10 Downing Street prepares for a new occupant, and we'll look at the challenges that lie ahead. Our other main story tonight: the UK swelters in a heat wave with record temperatures forecast later this week. We'll be looking at the effect of the rising temperatures across much of Europe and the role of climate change.
And coming up on Sports Day on BBC News, Geraint Thomas crashes again in the Tour de France, but he gets back on to stay second overall after the 16th stage.
Good evening. Boris Johnson is set to walk in this door behind me tomorrow as Britain's next Prime Minister, realising a long-held ambition. He's won the race to become Conservative Party leader with more than 92,000 votes of Conservative Party members. His rival, Jeremy Hunt, polled just over 46,000. In a short acceptance speech, Mr Johnson declared that his mission was to take Britain out of the EU by the 31st of October and to reunite the country. The challenges he will face are formidable. Opposition from some of the party's most senior MPs and little sign that the EU is about to change its negotiating position. Here's our political editor Laura Kuenssberg on the election of the man who tomorrow will become Britain's next Prime Minister.
On the way to meet his fate, the position he'd so long dreamed of.
Thank you.
On the way to hear whether he'd overturned what felt inevitable.
How are you feeling about the results?
Zen like calm.
Boris Johnson's supporters knew after a bumpy start they'd the advantage.
Feeling positive this morning.
But as ever in politics, the actual result, the prize.
It's not the result in that folder, is it? You will all find out the result when it's announced. Do you already know?
Jeremy Hunt then grinning and bearing it. Mr Johnson may be wondering, what now?
I give notice that Boris Johnson is elected as the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party.
A brief moment of where do I go now as the rest of the room got to its feet. A thumping majority for Mr Johnson, a knowingly controversial pick.
There will be people around the place who will question the wisdom of your decision. And there may even be some people here who still wonder what they have done. No one party, no one person has a monopoly of wisdom. But if you look at the history of the last 200 years of this party's existence, you will see that it is we Conservatives who have had the best insights.
Talking as the Tory campaigner, complete with gags, Prime Minister with the most serious of tasks from tomorrow.
At this pivotal moment in our history, we again have to reconcile two sets of instincts, two noble sets of instincts, between the deep desire for friendship and free trade and mutual support in security and defence between Britain and our European partners, and the simultaneous desire, equally deep and heartfelt, for democratic self-government in this country.
Brexit's not impossible, he says. It can and must be done.
Well, I look at you this morning and I ask myself, do you look daunted? Do you feel daunted? I don't think you look remotely daunted. The people of this country are trusting in us to do it, and we know that we will do it.
On the threshold of number 10, still entertaining this crowd.
And I know some wag has already pointed out that deliver, unite and defeat was not the perfect acronym for an election campaign, since unfortunately it spells dud. But they forgot the final E, my friends, E for energise. And I say to all the doubters, dude, we are going to energise the country. We're going to get Brexit done in a new spirit of can-do. We are going to unite this amazing country. The campaign is over and the work begins. Thank you all very much.
But his inheritance as leader means it might just not mean work, maybe a miracle or three.
It's a big day for Brexiteers. You are now in charge.
Well, Mr Johnson is in charge and he has my full support. He will now be forming a cabinet and I'm sure he will use that to make sure he can deliver Brexit.
He is a divisive candidate, isn't he?
Well, it didn't feel like that in this room. I mean, this room, it felt that there was total commitment to trying to get behind our new Prime Minister-to-be and make this work. But nobody underestimates the difficulty, least of all our new man.
My ambition just skipped a generation. Well, who could be happier?
So to work. The sight of the next Prime Minister's cavalcade making its way around Westminster. The first and vital symbolic task, what to do with the runner-up and the rest of the cabinet.
This was always going to be uphill for us because I was someone who voted Remain. We have a Prime Minister who voted Remain, and I think lots of Conservative Party members felt that this was a moment when you just had to have someone who voted for Brexit.
One MP joked with Mr Johnson, the circus has come to town. Some ministers quitting. They don't want to take part.
The Prime Minister will get all my support from the backbenches. Doesn't matter whether you're in government or not. But I do have grave concerns about leaving without a deal. And I also abstained last week, so it's the proper thing to do.
Yet thousands of miles away, a warmer response than from some in his party.
They're saying Britain Trump. They call him Britain Trump. And people are saying that's a good thing. That they like me over there. That's what they wanted. That's what they need. That's what they need. He'll get it done. Boris is good.
He's the master here now, the new leader arriving to meet the party troops at Conservative headquarters. A victory for a man whose political career has been down almost as much as up. A triumph of animal spirits over analysis, perhaps. Boris Johnson's big sell, belief.
You can't question Mr Johnson's enthusiasm for the pursuit of ambition, nor his promise to making the most of Brexit, cleaning up the mess he helped create. As he was cheered by Tory MPs in the Commons this afternoon, they all know. A sumptuous turn of phrase, a love of controversy and power won't be enough on their own. Leaving celebrations in Mayfair with campaign friends tonight, can he believe it?
Has it sunk in yet?
Thank you. Getting there.
Getting there, he says. It's real, all right. Laura Kuenssberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Throughout his political career, Boris Johnson has served as London Mayor, Foreign Secretary, and has been credited with securing victory for the Leave campaign in the Brexit referendum. But what else do we know about the man who will enter Downing Street tomorrow? Our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young, takes a look at the career of our next Prime Minister.
Please call me Boris.
Boris.
The celebrity politician who defies the normal rules of politics.
The thing I love is being Mayor of London.
Say Brexit!
And today, Boris Johnson has fulfilled his childhood dream to become Prime Minister.
I have seen Boris over the last few months become increasingly reflective of the scale of the challenge that he is about to take on. And I am absolutely convinced that he is emotionally and intellectually ready for this. He knows the scale of it, and he's up to it.
Boris Johnson's path to the top is a well-trodden one, the 20th Prime Minister to be schooled at Eton.
The House will proceed to a division.
He went on to study classics at Oxford University. A career in journalism followed, with a stint in Brussels for The Telegraph, where he relished mocking the European Commission.
I didn't want to be totally stitched up here.
His profile was boosted by TV appearances. Boris Johnson had set his sights on a political career, and where better than the safe Conservative seat of Henley-upon-Thames. But even back then, as Boris Johnson tried to become the Conservatives' candidate, the local party was divided over his talents. Some were attracted to this slightly eccentric, larger-than-life personality, but others were concerned about whether he could be taken seriously.
What you see is what you get. You get the hands going through the hair, you get the slightly dishevelled look. It's appealing to a lot of people. We found that when we were campaigning with Boris and when he was an MP, he would need people behind him to make everything happen. He'd be the person with the charisma, the person who was leading the charge.
And that's the approach he took when he was elected Mayor of London in 2008.
I'm going to have a point of bitter.
It's such an honour to have you here, Mr. Mayor.
Oh, please call me Boris.
Mr. Johnson was the charismatic frontman, happy to perform for the cameras. Oh no! And the mishaps only added to the celebrity status.
Release the rings into position now. Gold medal.
His supporters say his leadership style is all about creating a feel-good factor.
He's very good at bringing people together, actually. Some people consider him to be divisive because of things that he's written and things that he's said in the past. However, he's able to go into a room and he's able to get people feeling positive and feeling like they can achieve some change. He did it in London. Let's hope he can do it for the country.
Over the years, his private life brought unwanted press attention.
I have absolutely no comment.
During his 25-year marriage, he had several affairs. He was sacked as a Conservative spokesman for lying about one of them. Last year, he split up from his wife, Marina. Professional relationships have been strained too. Mr. Johnson's 2 years as Foreign Secretary brought awkward moments, some with serious consequences. He mistakenly told MPs that a British citizen imprisoned in Iran had been training journalists in the country. He suggested Libya had a bright future if it could only clear the dead bodies away. Colleagues complained that he didn't focus on important details and found it hard to make decisions.
There is this real trust deficit, so that he hasn't done what he's supposed to have done, that he hasn't read his briefs, he hasn't turned up to things, he hasn't put the country first, but he's put himself first.
But friends insist his unconventional approach can charm even the toughest of audiences.
The bastion of independence.
Many Conservative MPs are pinning their hopes on Boris Johnson because they believe he's a winner. He drew adoring crowds when he led the Vote Leave campaign. But Brexit has proved to be the most divisive of issues.
I like it, it's brilliant.
And the new Prime Minister will need more than exuberance, charisma and a bit of optimism. Vicky Young, BBC News.
Well, throughout the day there's been reaction to Boris Johnson's victory from the main opposition parties.
He's been elected on a programme which appears to be tax write-offs for the very richest and a no-deal exit from the European Union. I think he needs to think a bit more carefully about where we're going.
Boris Johnson should not underestimate the strength with which my government, my party will fight against Brexit generally, but a no-deal Brexit in particular.
I'm looking forward to a more dynamic relationship in the sense that it will be more of an ongoing relationship, conversations, involvement. I think that's important, not just with us, but with all wings of the Conservative Party as well. And I think that Boris's style is to do that kind of thing.
Boris Johnson is not fit to be Prime Minister. He's shown that time and time again, whether it's the diplomatic gaffes that he has frankly revelled in, causing offence gratuitously to people, and the fact that he just doesn't care about anyone but himself.
Well, our political editor Laura Kuenssberg is with me here. So, Laura, it all starts tomorrow for Boris Johnson. Tomorrow's the big day. He appoints his new cabinet. What are you hearing?
Well, tomorrow will be the day when we witness the most brutal thing that happens in British politics. The serving Prime Minister, still Theresa May, comes out and says a farewell in front of the country, and then probably within half an hour or so, Boris Johnson will make the lonely walk up Downing Street and introduce himself to the nation in a way that he didn't do today when he was talking to his party. But as you suggest, for any incoming Prime Minister, the first big task is to appoint their cabinet. If you like, the cabinet's like the index to the book the Prime Minister wants to write about themselves. I'm told tonight that Boris Johnson will promise to hire a record number of female politicians and ethnic minority politicians to have seats around the cabinet table. He's also, I'm told, planning to promote some of the rising generation in the Tory party. Now, those decisions are interesting because they push back at some of the assumptions that people have made about Boris Johnson, that some more traditional Conservatives see him as their ticket to somehow restoring things, the old-fashioned way of doing things. But it will be a fascinating day, and the biggest thing to look out for is how many Brexiteers will he move into senior positions? Because after 3 years of angst, today was the day that the Brexiteers finally took charge.
Well, 3 years of angst, as you say, and Boris Johnson has big challenges ahead.
Not just challenges, nightmares, Fiona. A divided party still, a parliament that's been stuck in stalemate with no real sense of any dramatic movement, however hopeful and optimistic Boris Johnson says he feels right now. But the interesting thing is, again and again, when you talk to his supporters on all sides of the party, because it's important to understand his election to be on the threshold of number 10 does represent an achievement from someone whose career was been in the doldrums, and he's managed to stitch together a coalition in the Tory party itself between people from all sides of the spectrum. But what he has to try to do is say more than things will work because I believe in them. That's what he always wants people to hear. That's the conviction that sort of comes off him in waves when he speaks in public. But conviction and belief can't run a government on their own, and that's going to be his challenge. Can he turn the fine words and rhetoric into something that works for real?
We shall see. Thanks very much. Well, one of the major issues of many facing Boris Johnson is Scotland, where there are fears his premiership could prove divisive, weakening Conservative support and putting increasing strain on the Union. Scotland, of course, voted to remain in the EU. Our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith, looks now at the reaction from voters there.
In Glasgow this evening, protesters are demanding independence now, hoping Boris Johnson and his do-or-die Brexit plans won't go down well in Scotland and might actually help to hasten their ambition. Stirling is the most marginal Conservative seat in Scotland. Inside number 10, the guest house, local Tory activists watched the result being announced.
So you voted for Jeremy Hunt. How do you feel about the fact that Boris Johnson's won?
Well, he's won. He's what we've got to deal with now. I would have preferred if Jeremy had won, but we now have a new leader. So now the party must come behind Boris.
The sheer optimism of Boris Johnson in a post-Brexit Britain will be very infectious.
Are you sure that the Union is safe in Boris Johnson's hands?
Yes, I do believe so. I believe that he has to come up here and clarify his position very quickly.
Needs to listen to Ruth Davidson, who knows Scottish politics better than anyone else, and he needs to have that counsel.
On opposite sides of the Brexit debate, the Scottish Tory leader and Mr Johnson are not exactly natural allies.
He wasn't my choice for leader. I didn't vote for him. However, I will judge his premiership by his actions in office.
The key question in Scotland is whether Boris Johnson as Prime Minister makes independence any more likely. And that's about policy as much as personality. A no-deal Brexit looks much less palatable in Remain voting Scotland and could cause some voters to change their mind about the United Kingdom.
What do you think about having Boris Johnson as PM?
Well, I think if you like circuses, you've got a nice clown. Yeah, no, I think it's great. I hope he does good things. I think he will.
So does Prime Minister Johnson make independence more likely?
Yeah, probably does. Yeah, I think he'll be making decisions that the Scottish Government won't agree with and will be pushing more so for independence.
Someone like Boris, who is a bit haphazard, it might, I think it might push a few more people to vote SNP or someone else.
Even if some more Scots do now want their say on independence, Boris Johnson has vowed not to allow another Scottish referendum anytime soon. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Stirling.
Well, as we've heard, throughout the leadership contest, Mr Johnson said repeatedly that he will ensure the UK leaves the European Union by October the 31st, with or without a deal. But he faces a battle with Parliament. Our Deputy Political Editor John Pienaar looks in more detail at the challenge Brexit poses for the new Prime Minister and the timetable ahead.
He's wanted this for years, sometimes so much it's hurt. Now what'll he do? About Brexit, about leaving by October the 31st. Do or die, remember? Because the Brexiteers who helped him certainly will. Those Brexiteers will be in here with him watching, because Mr Johnson's promised to seek or demand a better Brexit deal or else. Or else what? Well, to leave without one, if he can, unless the EU backs down and makes concessions they've never offered before. So, what are the chances? Well, Brexit may be on the agenda next time EU leaders gather on October the 17th. We'll have an idea how Mr Johnson's getting on with his pledge to renegotiate the terms of Brexit and maybe looking for common ground on a possible extension, though Mr Johnson says he doesn't want one, and certainly on the Irish border issue, the so-called backstop, the big obstacle so far. Brexiteers see it as potentially shackling Britain to the EU, Northern Ireland tighter. It's there to avoid stops and checks on the EU's Irish border, keeping the UK within EU customs rules. Mr Johnson wants it scrapped, not reformed, not time-limited, scrapped. The EU has never barged from saying it must stay. And trade rules, Boris Johnson's idea of keeping all tariffs, border charges, at zero, while a trade deal is thrashed out. He's argued the fallback rules of the World Trade Organization may allow that, but they don't unless a deal is nearly ready, and it isn't. Mr Johnson's threatened to hold on to the divorce payment of £39 billion. But that might just poison the atmosphere, end up in court, and the EU say they won't even talk until that debt is made good. So we may be heading for a no-deal Brexit, unless Parliament stops that happening. The numbers in the Commons add up to trouble for Mr Johnson, a government majority of just 2, and that includes 10 DUP allies. It could be only 1 after a tricky by-election in Brecon and Radnorshire on August the 1st. So just 2 Tory rebels could mean defeat for the government, and more Conservatives than that oppose a no-deal Brexit, even if Mr Johnson ramps up no-deal preparations as promised. So what next? MPs could take control in the Commons, find a way to block no deal, perhaps even beat the government on a confidence vote if there's no other way. And that could mean a general election with who knows what outcome. Boris Johnson's enjoying his moment of triumph. He'll soon see himself, if he hasn't already, that Brexit is no joke.
Our Deputy Political Editor John Pienaar there. Now, Europe's chief Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier said today that he looked forward to working with the new Prime Minister to achieve an orderly Brexit. But does that mean Boris Johnson will find a way through this issue where Theresa May failed? Our Europe editor Katja Adler joins us from Garmisch in Bavaria. So Katja, what signals from Europe about how negotiations with the new Prime Minister might proceed?
Well, look, Fiona, there were messages of congratulations from across Europe today. EU Commission Chief Jean-Claude Juncker said he hoped to work as constructively as possible with Boris Johnson. And in these divisive Brexit times of them and us, Emmanuel Macron of France reminded the new Prime Minister that EU-UK relations stretch far beyond Brexit, that whatever happens with Brexit, when it comes, for example, to Iran or to Russia sanctions, the EU still sees the UK as a very close ally on the world stage. That said, those warm and welcoming words, which essentially are polite diplomacy, of course, shouldn't be misconstrued as the EU taking a new line just because we're getting a new Prime Minister. On the one hand, Boris Johnson is right. The EU does have more flexibility over the Brexit deal than it's wanted really to let on until now. But on the other hand, he's probably wrong if he thinks that the threat of a no-deal Brexit, however credible and however much we know that EU leaders would prefer to avoid it, will force a major rethink in Brussels. EU leaders' flexibility is actually much more constrained than that. They're not going to want to make decisions or compromises that ultimately will hurt them. So some changes to that Irish backstop guarantee possible if Dublin says yes, but getting rid of the backstop altogether, which would mean exposing EU leaders' lucrative single market to the possibility of smuggled non-regulation goods. It would mean them turning their back on member state Ireland. I don't see them going in that direction at all. And something else to bear in mind, Fiona, is that EU leaders are unlikely to want to make any changes at all unless they are absolutely convinced that those changes will allow Boris Johnson to get that Brexit withdrawal agreement through Parliament once and for all.
Katya, thank you. And stepping away from politics and all things Brexit just for a moment, most of the UK has been in the grip of a heat wave today. I'm sure it hasn't escaped your attention, and there's going to be little respite for many of us overnight. Forecasters are predicting tonight could be the hottest on record, with temperatures not falling below 24 degrees in the southeast. So what, if anything, does this latest hot spell tell us about how our climate is changing? Here's our chief environment correspondent, Justin Rowland.
With the jet stream drawing heat up from Africa, where would you go but the beach? And that's where thousands headed today. Here in Bournemouth, the water was as crowded as the sand. Everyone was looking for a way to cool down. In Wiltshire, Longleat laid on special treats, with ice lollies for the lions. Not so pleasant for travellers, though. The NHS issued warnings for vulnerable people to stay in the shade and keep hydrated. London experienced the highest temperatures, which peaked at a sweltering 33.7 degrees centigrade. Like most of the rest of the UK, it is 8 to 10 degrees above the average for this time of year, and it's set to get even hotter. Forecasters are saying it could go as high as 38 degrees on Thursday. That would be an all-time record for July. And they're set to score some records across Europe this week too. France and Germany are expecting scorching heat, and it's likely to top 40 degrees in the Netherlands and Belgium for the first time. Meanwhile, firefighters say wildfires in Portugal have finally been brought under control. So when does extreme weather become evidence of climate change?
If we think about a climate, a natural climate if you like, that hadn't been affected by human-induced emissions of greenhouse gases, then we'd of course expect to see the occasional heat wave. But when we're seeing them spread really quite a lot over the hemisphere, that's something that would be very unlikely to happen without human-induced climate change.
The trend is clear. Globally, over the last century, the temperature has been rising, with the last 4 years the warmest ever. And hot weather is deadly. Last summer's heatwave is estimated to have caused over 800 early deaths, says Public Health England. So staying cool this summer could be a lifesaver. Justin Rowland, BBC News.
Let's take a brief look now at some of today's other stories. And South Korean warplanes have fired warning shots at a Russian surveillance plane which entered its airspace earlier today. Officials claimed 2 other Russian aircraft also passed through its air defense zone. Russia denied warning shots were fired and said its planes were over neutral waters. British Airways has failed in a bid for a temporary High Court injunction to halt industrial action by its pilots over a pay dispute. Members of the pilots' union voted by more than 9 to 1 to take action, which could cause serious disruption to summer flights. No dates have yet been set. Welsh victims of the contaminated blood scandal have begun giving evidence to the inquiry headed by Sir Brian Langstaff. Susan Sparks told today's Cardiff hearing that her late husband Leslie felt he was a murderer after contracting HIV from infected blood. The scandal affected at least 300 people in Wales. Back now to our main story tonight, and now we know that Boris Johnson will assume his role as Prime Minister tomorrow. But the referendum in 2016 fundamentally realigned politics. Our special correspondent Alan Little has been travelling the country, listening to people's views, and considers how politics has changed and the challenges that will bring for the new Prime Minister.
Look at the House of Commons. You'd think from the shape of it that Britain was still divided along traditional party lines, the old Labour-Tory duopoly that has dominated national life for a century. But the divide in Parliament no longer reflects the divide outside these walls. Out there in the country, it's not about left versus right anymore. The two main political tribes among the people are now Remain and Leave. Each of these two tribes coheres around a distinct set of values that were forged in a decades-long argument about Europe. This is not a fight about which party should be in power for the next few years. It's much more fundamental than that. It's a battle to define the national character, to define the values on which that character should be based, and the place Britain should seek in the wider world. The Shire counties of England are places of enduring tradition. This is Gloucestershire, mostly Conservative voting and Leave-leaning. Now it's on the same side of the great Brexit divide as working-class Labour strongholds such as Stoke-on-Trent or Wigan. Sharon Sugars works in hospitality at this 400-year-old manor house. She's a Conservative activist who campaigned to remain, but wants the referendum result respected. She says the new Prime Minister must deliver Brexit, because if he doesn't...
What it's probably going to open the door to is Labour going down, Conservative going down, Liberal coming up, and the Brexit Party. You know, if we haven't actually managed to deliver on Brexit, it's those two parties that are going to, you know, really pick up the pieces from that fallout. Because I think the general public, they certainly don't want to see the Conservative Party, you know, don't wash your dirty linen in public. And I think we've been doing a little bit too much of that lately.
Local Conservatives are gearing up for a general election. In his back garden in the Cotswolds, Peter Manchin told me he voted for Boris Johnson as the leader most likely to beat Labour.
The main challenge, obviously, is what to do with Brexit. Can he get a deal that will go through Parliament? And if not, then he's going to almost certainly have to have an election.
This is what local Conservatives need to fear. The Brexit Party swept the board in the European elections, sending Anne Widdecombe to Brussels. The Tory vote collapsed. Do you know people here who have been traditionally Conservative voters who switched to the Brexit Party in the European elections?
Could be one or two. Could be one or two.
Did you vote Conservative in the European elections?
I'm not going to say what I voted in the European elections.
That is a very Tory disaffection, but it finds its echo in a very different England. This is Labour voting Stoke-on-Trent. Much of its proud industrial heritage has been reduced to dereliction. Here, Leave sentiment seems motivated by a sense that a cherished part of the city's identity has been lost.
Next Wednesday, did you say?
Earlier this year, I met Shirley Ray.
I don't feel proud to be British anymore. And I think a lot of people feel the same way as well. I think we're a laughingstock of the world. No, I just want us out. To be honest, I've got no confidence in any of the MPs. At all.
Metropolitan Manchester is also traditional Labour territory, but the contrast with the declining old industrial heartlands is stark. Everywhere you look, there is regeneration, renewal. Labour voters here see Brexit as a threat to this success.
People's views on the need for a public vote have changed dramatically. Right the way across the north, the majority want to see whatever deal they come up with in Westminster going back to a second vote, to another vote, a vote specifically on the deal.
The new Prime Minister inherits, above all, multiple division. The Conservative Party is divided, the Labour Party is divided. Brexit has divided the English against each other. It pits England against Scotland and Northern Ireland, which voted strongly to remain. This is the task he faces, to give this country back a shared sense of itself and of what it stands for, at home and in the world. Alan Little, BBC News.
Well, as we've been hearing this evening, tomorrow Theresa May will leave number 10 for the last time. Shortly after that, Boris Johnson will travel to Buckingham Palace, where the Queen will ask him to form a government. We'll be back tomorrow night with all the latest, including those cabinet appointments. But that's all from Downing Street tonight. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Bye-bye.